Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reclaiming the Narrative, exploring the history of first Africans in Virginia through descendant engagement. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Quinn Houlihan, and I'll be responsible for hosting this session. The session chair is Yola Dance, and will be leading today's session. Before we get started, we will be recording this session and ask that you please turn off your video and mute your microphone to improve the bandwidth to ensure the session runs smoothly. We ask that if you have questions or comments, please use the Zoom chat option located at the bottom of your screen. Please hold all questions for the speakers until the end. The session will run for 1 hour and 45 minutes. You can find and turn on captions at the bottom of your Zoom screen. After the meeting, participants will be able to engage with Dwayne and Joe on the Hoover Meetup channel. Thank you again for attending today's session. Yola Dance will now introduce the first speaker of the session.
Greetings. My name is Yola Dance. I'm currently serving as the acting superintendent at Fort Monroe National Monument. Fort Monroe is a sister park to Jamestown and Yorktown, which make up Colonial National Historical Park. And I welcome you to Reclaiming the Narrative. Since 2016, the National Park Service has had the opportunity to fund over $14 million in African American civil rights historic preservation fund grant programs. These grants have funded over 400 years of African American history in research as well as preservation. Much of this work has taken place at historic sites like Fort Monroe and Jamestown, but also at Black colleges and universities across the country. Other grants have funded not only this type of research, but other aspects of civil rights movement. This particular project is in partnership with the National Park Service, the College of William and Mary, and a host of community partners who are identified as descendants, as well as some of our partners like Preservation Virginia. Some of those descendant communities include the 1624 Tucker Society, as well as Project 1619. We have been working together to foster and rebuild relationships with descendant communities at historic Jamestown Island and communities such as Slabtown and Uniontown in Yorktown, Virginia. This work draws on best practices that we will discuss today that help us to explore the topics of slavery, resistance, and freedom through interdisciplinary approaches in archaeology, ethnography, and history. We thank you for joining us for this roundtable discussion with our research partners. In addition, we welcome one of our key partners in preservation, the National Park Foundation. And today, Monica Rhodes, the Director of Resource Management, will guide us through this discussion with our scholars. Monica oversees grant making to the National Park Service, supporting rehabilitation of historic sites and landscapes, as well as expansion of interpretive narratives. She's led efforts to develop strategies for African Americans, Latinx, LGBTQ, and other underrepresented communities. Some of her past work included leading engagement efforts with the National Trust, such as the HOPE program, which is hands-on preservation experience focusing on youth and diverse communities and introducing them to preservation fields. Monica earned her undergraduate degree at the University of Tulsa in history, her master's degree in African American studies at Temple, and an additional master's degree in historic preservation at the University of Pennsylvania. We thank you so much, Monica, for joining us and for leading this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Superintendent Dance, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Monica Rhodes with the National Park Foundation. And for all those on the phone, the National Park Foundation is the philanthropic partner for the National Park Service. So we primarily are focusing on bringing private philanthropy to the benefit of the American public through our national parks. To do that, we fund several programs. One is our Women in Parks program that really focuses in on bringing more diverse stories that center women and the National Park Service. Our Latino Heritage Fund, which is a 15-year-old fund that we've been funding and investing in the Park Service to diversify the stories that are told around our Latino brothers and sisters. And then our African American Experience Fund, which is a 20-year-old program started under the direction of former director of the Park Service, Mr. Bob Stanton, to invest in, preserve, and protect national park sites that help tell a broader story around the African American history and culture through that experience. And then finally, we also help support our citizen science and open outdoors for kids, where we work to bring in school-age children into the Park Service. So with the time that I have, I want to make sure that I am giving enough room for our esteemed panelists to share out their experiences. So I'd like to transition our discussion into an overview of our panelists. And in this presentation, we have it broken up into three phases. First, I'll do the introduction, and each panelist will then have 5 minutes to speak. And then we'd like to open the floor for questions to our audience and hear more about your very good thinking about what we are expecting from this phenomenal group of professionals. So first, I'd like to start with an introduction of Dr. Michael Blakey. He is a National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Anthropology, Africana Studies, and American Studies, and the founding director of the Institute for Historical Biology at the College of William and Mary. Dr. Blakey was a key advisor of the award-winning Race, Are We So Different exhibition of the American Anthropological Association. Next, we have Professor Audrey Horning, who is an anthropology professor at William and Mary and also a professor of archeology at Queen's University Belfast, and a fellow of the Center of George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice. Dr. Horning is an archaeologist that also researches the intersection in comparing colonialism with the integration of archaeology and conflict transformation. And finally, we have Dr. Joseph Jones, who is a lecturer of anthropology at William and Mary. He is a research associate of the Institute for Historical Biology and the William Cobb Research Laboratory at Howard University. A biological anthropologist, his work involves descendant community engagement and skeletal research on the African diasporic biohistory and health. He has published on slavery and environmental chemical lead exposure of the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan. So with that said, I'm looking forward to hearing from Dr. Blakey first, and then we'll have Dr. Horning join the conversation, followed with Dr. Jones. So Dr. Blakey, please take the floor.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ms. Rhodes, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin my presentation with the question that I understand to be at the center of the discussion, which is, how can descendant communities tell their own story, especially involving large public institutions like the National Park Service or presidential estates and museums, not just at the kitchen table, but tell their own story to the nation and to the world. 30 years ago, really up until, and 12 or so years after that, I was director of the African Burial Ground, the New York African Burial Ground, where we began to address this question in archaeology using our clientage model of public engagement. And this is where we coined the term descendant community for archaeological use as a handle that gave, assigned ethical power, named the reasons for the stewardship of these descendants over their ancestral remains. And as I'll describe shortly, this has a clientage model in which the community has control of whether research will be done on skeletal remains or not, has evolved to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's rubric, in which descendant communities have at least structural parity or, quote, full partnership with the institutions in the construction of their narrative, of their story, and benefiting also, according to the National Trust rubric, from the everything that is brought in by at museums and historic sites, so that they are full partners in every way. That is the goal of the rubric. Sets out different levels of achievement. That what I'm describing, that complete partnership, represents the exemplary status of public engagement with descendant communities. At the bottom, there's inadequate engagement with communities by historic sites and museums, and everything in between. Let me say that I think, as collaborative archaeologists are learning around the world, we discovered 25 or 30 years ago that the empowerment of the community is the key question. There's recent work going on in Australia with Native Australians and in Africa, in which they are just coming to see this as the fundamental structural difference between the ability to be heard. So I can say that the Institute for Historical Biology has worked over the last 20 years to continue efforts in the direction laid out in New York, to work with communities in New York, Bethesda, Maryland, Africatown in Mobile, Alabama. I think very prominently our work with James Madison's Montpelier, along with the National Trust, to see that they have their Montpelier Descendants Committee has equal empowerment to the Montpelier Foundation's Board of Directors. This is where it gets sticky, but this is where the real development of a voice, of where people can say and express what they want to know. The research questions that researchers would conduct will be along the lines of not only what researchers are interested in, but what real people in a real community who are really affected ethically by the story that is told are fully involved in that, in the sense of a kind of informed consent, that level of ethical treatment given to the interpretation of history. So I think that's how I wanted to introduce my thoughts, and I look forward to hearing all the conversation that my colleagues have coming.
Thank you, Dr. Blakey. Now let's like to turn the conversation to Dr. Horning.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. My role in the current work with the National Park Service is basically working towards expanding and enhancing existing interpretation of the histories of Slabtown, Uniontown, through descendant community engagement and empowerment, as Dr. Blakey's just said. Slabtown was established by self-emancipated individuals in 1863 in Yorktown, and it grew into a really thriving community. But the community's lands were effectively systematically targeted for inclusion in the national park of the 20th century. And in the 1970s, the last properties were purchased or acquired through condemnation proceedings. So the houses were leveled, but the site, for the most part, left undeveloped. So with the support of the Park Service, I'm working with one of my PhD students, Chandler Fitzsimons, and we are really seeking guidance, especially from those who were displaced directly and their descendants, as well as the broader affinity group that we are trying to help establish, as to how to better tell the stories and honor the memories of the Slabtown inhabitants. And I think first and foremost, we want to know what descendants actually wish to know and to share about Slabtown's history and what they want to see happen with the site. And that may or it may not include archaeological research, depending on what their desires are. I'm also involved in the Jamestown project because in the 1990s, I conducted research on the history of a number of 17th century burials that were unearthed in the 1930s and 1940s. And 5 of those appear to be persons of African descent whose bodies were basically disposed of in open boundary ditches in the 3rd to 4th quarter of the 17th century. And in the 1990s, this was a story of colonial racial injustice that nobody really wanted to talk about. So I'm very happy to be part of the process now, with the Park Service of seeking community guidance on how best to understand and memorialize these individuals. I suppose because I felt a responsibility to them for almost 30 years. If you'll allow me, I just wanted to say a few words about some of my own practice, because I suppose it's a slightly different trajectory. I probably first learned the value of listening to descendant communities when I worked in Colonial National Park. That was also in the 1990s, and I was surveying and documenting historic communities who'd been displaced by park creation in the 30s. And I learned the most in that work from talking to the people who've been forced to leave. And I ultimately became very committed to ensuring their stories were told. And the archaeological record in that instance proved pretty instrumental in challenging narratives about backward hillbillies, if you like, and addressed many, not all, but many descendant concerns. But since that time, since the late 1990s, where I've gained the most practical experience when it comes to engagement and social justice has been in Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland was a setting for 30-year violent sectarian conflict known as the Troubles, which officially ended in 1998. But Northern Ireland is still riven with division between its 2 traditions, broadly drawn Catholic nationalist self-identified heirs of the Gaelic Irish, and Protestant stroke unionist heirs to 17th century English and Scottish settlers. Both communities see themselves as oppressed minorities, both communities suffered violence, both communities perpetrated violence. But given that today's division is rooted in beliefs about the past, and like Jamestown, this is a past that's rooted in 17th century British colonialism, archaeology emerged as a powerful tool in peace building. So basically incorporating community members from across the divide in archaeological projects can be transformative, basically through the encounter with evidence and having to negotiate over what that evidence means. But this involves challenging long-held narratives. This is risky, and that's why I work in partnership with Corrymeela, which is Northern Ireland's oldest peace centre. So just to sort of summarize from all those sort of different routes to getting where I'm sitting today, I'm honored to be sitting today, is I think that the most important lesson that I've learned so far anyway is the importance of listening and hearing. And this relies on a standpoint that Alice Keogh calls epistemic humility. So I shall now listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Horning. I'd like to bring in Dr. Jones at this point to join the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Rhodes, Drs. Blakey and Horning. And so I'm Joseph Jones. I'm a lecturer of anthropology at the College of William and Mary. I am by a trade a skeletal biologist. I came to this position kind of by way of actually the African burial ground. I was an undergraduate at Howard when Dr. Blakey was directing the project, and immediately saw the value, of anthropology for asking long-held questions that I had about human diversity and the nature of social inequality and so forth. And so it's through the lens of kind of biology as a window onto these processes of inequality and how they go on to affect human diversity and health that I initially approached this specifically with questions about the African diaspora and the impact of slavery upon our ancestors. And so I went from the African Burial Ground Project, I worked on that throughout my graduate studies. From there, went to a different form of engagement, worked on the race project Race Are We So Different project, public education initiative of the American Anthropological Association, in which we did again, a different form of engagement, one that involved more educational outreach. It was less advocacy, less activism, but more of a transmission of information, what anthropologists knew and didn't know about race, racism, and, as an idea, as concepts, and as material realities in the U.S. And so I kind of managed the second phase. I managed the second phase of that project before returning back to finish the doctorate and coming to the College of William and Mary. And now I am returning to this focus on kind of community, descendant community engagement with models that I learned, again, under Dr. Blakey and as part of the African Burial Ground Project. And I'm now applying those to the project that we'll talk about today at Jamestown, and then also to a somewhat conceptually, maybe epistemologically similar project to the African Burial Ground in Richmond, Virginia, at Virginia Commonwealth University, referring to the East Marshall Street Well Project, where remains were found in a well or a quote unquote sink, where individuals had been disposed, mainly African Americans, had been disposed as medical debris in the early to mid 19th century. These were individuals who had been used as cadavers for medical training purposes, and their bodies had been disposed along with faunal remains and tools and other implements in this well. These are individuals who, some of whom would have most likely have been grave robbed for this purpose. And there's some oral history that suggests that not only the dead were used for these purposes, that there's oral history in which African Americans were told not to be around downtown Richmond after dark, or they could end up in what was Hampton Sydney Medical College at the time. It becomes Medical College of Virginia and is now referred to as VCU Health. And so I work with that on that project in a couple of capacities now. I chair the Family Representative Council, which is their descendant community group, and we provided recommendations as to research, memorialization, and ultimately the burial and or reburial of these individuals. And currently I'm co-chairing the Research Implementation Committee. We brought the remains back from the Smithsonian about a little over a year ago. It actually would have been November of 2019, and are working pretty diligently now to establish a research agenda, really following a model that was established initially by the African Burial Ground, and kind of and developing that in a unique way that suits the needs of descendant community members here in Richmond, Virginia. And so at Jamestown, we're working to develop, to similarly develop a descendant community entity. We just met to discuss the form that might take, met with community members, and we will be working with them to establish an entity that through which they can voice, all of their questions, concerns, and so forth. So I'll stop there and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. Before we get into our Q&A period, I'd like to turn the conversation to Dr. Dwayne Scheid, who is representing the National Park Service. He currently serves as the acting division lead for resource stewardship and science at Colonial National Historical Park. Dwayne received his PhD from Syracuse University's Department of Anthropology and completed his dissertation examining the people and products of the local ceramic industry in the 18th century Barbados. So Dr. Scheid, please come on to the table and provide comment to really lay a groundwork for what am hopeful and know will be a very fruitful discussion. So I'll turn the discussion over to you.
Sure, thanks you, Monica. What I want to say, so I started working at Colonial National Historical Park in 2018. And by that time, the engagement process had already started. And they had had one meeting. It was more of a panel discussion that included several of the people here, as well as Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander and Dave Gibbons from Jamestown Rediscovery. And so that process had already really started of engaging with the public and talking to the African-American community about some of the possibilities for research that had been proposed, but also to discuss the Angela Project, which it was a project that was brought to the National Park Service's attention by Jamestown Rediscovery in 2016, and work started in 2017. And that work really, it was work that occurred on the Park Service's property. The work was conducted by Jamestown Rediscovery archaeologists. But that archaeology was really the first step in sort of what we envision this process could be. And, and so there's obviously a part of me that thinks that, some of it was out of order, right? Based on, including the community in the discussion of the ideas and the proposal. And so I think that while that sort of started off in a backwards way, I think that ultimately where it's led us is to this focus on the outreach group and the community engagement group, and the potential for partnering with members of the community on behalf of the Park Service. But I did want to, give them credit, Jamestown Rediscovery credit for a lot of this process starting. At roughly the same time, the National Park Service Colonial had a new superintendent and deputy superintendent who were eager to expand on the stories that the park told. If you're familiar with Jamestown and Yorktown, you're probably familiar with John Smith and Pocahontas and General Washington and Lafayette and Rochambeau and lots of other sort of white men typically. And so park leadership described and defined a strategic action priorities and goals based on that. And one of their main goals was, one of the three sort of top goals was to communicate untold stories and to expand the narrative that the Park Service was sharing at Colonial and at Jamestown and at Yorktown. I think that, and the Park Service has as Audrey mentioned, there has been a history of behavior that we would describe as unethical maybe now, but definitely, questionable decision-making processes that happened, between the 30s and the 70s. But then the Park Service, the park didn't talk about that story at all again until about 2013, when there was some work with the lineal descendants from Slabtown to develop an exhibit that's and some waysides, and to actually acknowledge what the park had done. And I think that that also put us in a firm footing to realize and recognize the importance of involving the community in these decisions, and to become more transparent about how we are doing things, and to include the community in that decision-making process. And so I think that there things have sort of turned around. And in my notes, I put like, basically I'd written some notes and I said something like, in 2013, and then I said like, either you can either describe it as like, either early or late, because 2013 is a long time after the 1970s to actually start talking about this displacement and to, really engaging with the community in a fair and equitable way. So, I think we're late to the process in some ways and early in others. But I know that as part of that Angela project, this outreach, formed, and the idea that we would like a community group that could help us, make decisions and to share power with and some of the decision making. I think that really, is a good thing for us to be working on now. And I think that we're in a place now, so I feel like we got on board late to the process, but sooner than some places. And so in the Park Service, there aren't a lot of models for us to look at for how this engagement is working. There are examples of where community groups and advisory groups have been formed, and so, but out of 422-ish units, we're in the top 10 as far as starting these projects and starting this outreach and engagement. And so I think that that's important for us to recognize. And so a lot of the engagement work that we've been doing with the College of William and Mary faculty members that you see today is to help us figure out some of the other some of those examples that are outside of the Park Service, and Dr. Blakey mentioned the National Trust model, the matrix, but also Dr. Jones's experience working with the communities in Richmond, and Dr. Audrey's work in both Northern Ireland, but also in the Shenandoah. I think we have a good team that's here to help us and try to help us get on track and stay on track. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Scheid. I want to keep the conversation with you before I go back to our other panelists about the role that the Park Service plays in public participation and civic engagement. And you shared out some of what Colonial National Historical Park is currently doing and NPS more broadly. But could you just talk a little bit more about the benefits of this public engagement process and what you've seen on the ground with community members answering the call to be engaged in this history?
Yeah, so, we've had 5 meetings now, 5 public meetings, and, they ranged from, I think one meeting, the lowest attended meeting had like 20 people, but we had one meeting that had 300 people. We just had a meeting this past Saturday that had probably around 60 people. So the community wants to be involved, or it seems that the community wants to be involved, and for the park, what it provides us with an opportunity is to work equitably and fairly with the community to discuss topics about research, like how we're going to do archaeology research, why we're doing archaeology research, which sites are appropriate to do archaeology research at, which sites are provide an opportunity to get answers for the community for questions that they ask. But we're also one of our issues at Jamestown that we're dealing with is climate change. And so we have 40 plus sites on the island that are threatened in different levels by climate change. And some of those sites have Native American components, and some of them have African American components. And so finding out by communicating with the community about what their level of comfort is and what their interests are is going to provide guidance for us as we evaluate and the site's vulnerability and significance, and help make decisions about which sites we preserve and which sites we end up not preserving, or which sites you do data recovery at, and which sites we protect as much as possible for as long as we can. In addition, one of the things that we didn't do that would be interesting to know is there's a type of tourist that comes to Jamestown and Yorktown, and typically that type of tourist is white, middle class, tends to be older population that comes to the site. And through the work at the Angela Project, by intentionally focusing archaeological research and interpretation at a site, identifying it as the Angela site rather than calling it the Pierce site, which is the property owner, identifying it as the Angela site and sort of intentionally focusing on identifying the landscape of, that would have been there when Angela was there. I think that between that and the outreach work that we're doing brought in a larger community of African American visitors to the site that could then participate, see the archaeology that was happening, talk to the archaeologists who were working, to get a better feel for what that might have looked like, and in a way that welcomes the community here. And what we've heard is from both the native, some of the native tribes, people that we're working with, and also with the African American community, is that they just didn't feel welcome at Jamestown, right? And because there's a historical, the island is split between Preservation Virginia and the National Park Service, but historically there's been a disconnect with the Newport News and the Hampton Roads area and the community members. And so so getting people that don't normally come to the park to hear about the Angela site, to hear about the archaeology work that's been done, talk about, as we're doing now with this outreach work that we're doing, to talk about how we can form a group and, what their interests are and who they think should be members, and, describing and defining the group as, and letting them have the power to decide that, I think is important in the scale of trying to get the African-American community and the Native American community to be comfortable at Jamestown, and to know that the park is telling their stories, and, they see waysides that talk about, difficult topics. Talking about slavery and enslavement is a difficult topic to talk about, but knowing that we're working on getting there, and knowing that we're, engaging with the community about commemoration and memorialization, those are all things that I think are positive, and in the long run will serve the park well in visitorship, but also in ideas and information sharing.
Well said, thank you. And as you were talking, I was just kind of thinking about this intersection of the past and present. And I want to bring in Dr. Jones, who's currently working on a project that is focusing on some structural racism and restorative justice. And so Dr. Jones, I wanted to hear a little bit more about your project, and how some of what Dr. Scheid has shared also has implications for the work that you're leading as well.
Sure, and I should say that Dr. Blakey was actually on the planning committee for that project, so he could also certainly could speak to this as well. But to follow up on Dr. Scheid's comments there, I think he said a few things. I think he said a few things that are very important, and that we shouldn't let slip by us. You mentioned, the past unethical behavior, I think, of the park. I think it's really important to hear that, and the community members have heard us, speak to that, and I think that speaks to their willingness to engage thus far. I think it's really important to that we acknowledge that, because then that positions us, right, to decide what we're going to do going forward. That suggests then that there has to be structural institutional change, lest we just continue down the path of unethical behavior, knowingly so. And so I think that's important. You mentioned also, the transparency, right, and which is important, necessary but insufficient. There has to be the transparency and change, right. And so I think that having that transparency is critical, but not only so that people can better understand the limitations that they think they see in the park, but that also that they can be participants in the change that they want to see, right. And so I think those are very, we shouldn't lose sight of, those really basic but important observations. For people to understand, I'll also say before mentioning, and I will get right onto the well project, for people to have a sense of some of that, I think I would point them towards another person who's been doing a lot of this important work, Sharday Reed, who's a graduate student here in the department. She's actually just published a piece, It's Not About Us, in the International Journal of Historical Archaeology. For anyone who's interested to see, essentially she summarizes much of what we found so far in terms of the community engagement, some of the interviews that she's conducted to see exactly how people feel about their relationship to the park and why they've not felt as welcome. And so yes, Ms. Rhodes, there are some serious similarities in terms of some of the structural, issues at play. Here in this case, you're looking at a federal institution. With the Well Project, you're looking at a state institution, Virginia Commonwealth University. And what I think worked, what has worked well so far in the East Marshall Street well example is that there was this, I think Dr. Horning mentioned epistemological humility. In our report, we referred to kind of the need for an institutional humility, the need to approach people as experts themselves, community members, and certainly as people who understand why they seek to engage or not to engage with these institutions, and to take seriously, the input that they can provide, and to provide. And Dr. Blakey can speak to this, kind of more detail, of course, but structural mechanisms for ensuring their voices are not only heard, but are acted upon. And so these are some of the challenges that I think we find in the inertia, to kind of default back to past behaviors is something that will have to be, I think, monitored for and controlled for. In either case, we are, as I mentioned, kind of working diligently on developing a research agenda. And as we do that, we're having to constantly remind ourselves and others not to default to symposia and panels and such that in which we end up speaking, only to or primarily or chiefly to ourselves about topics which we find very interesting, but that perhaps don't fully engage the imaginations or the concerns of community members. And so there's that, at a very fundamental level. But the ability, I think, of in this case of VCU to establish a mechanism, a process for listening, and then for listening to community members as to who they want to represent themselves, and then putting those people in a position to actually learn and provide actual informed consent. These were all part of a very intentional and well thought out process that the institution put into place so that people could actually give informed consent as opposed to having any extraction of consent. I think there's the practice typical of providing people just enough information to become excited about a research prospect or so forth, and then getting them on board to say, yes, we want to do that. As Dwayne alluded to, I think we were heading down that path right at Jamestown, and kind of, and rightfully, I think, and wisely, kind of, step back and paused with respect to research and say, let's wait, let's give people all the information they need so they can make truly informed decisions about genetics, whether or not DNA or chemical research should be done at a site, whether or not research should be done at all. These are all these can all be addressed structurally, right, through an actual process. And so, but I'll refer here to my senior scholars.
Yeah, so I think that's a great segue into a question that I wanted to ask Dr. Blakey, who's written and lectured at length about the connection between ethics and epistemology. So Dr. Blakey, could you please explain that for the audience about that, how those two are related?
Well, I should go back to the African burial ground in New York. And I was thinking, well, I did just mention that, and it may seem like what happened in the 1990s was just yesterday to me, but for many people may not even know what that site is. So it's an 18th century cemetery for Africans who were enslaved in New York. It was encountered by a U.S. General Services Administration building construction project. There would have been about 15,000 enslaved Africans there in the 18th century. They were probably about, and certainly by the end of the 18th century, about 20% of the population of New York. But the African American community assessed the way the GSA was handling those remains and its archaeological contractors as well as desecrating the remains. The essential, I think, difference between desecration and science, or desecration and memorialization, has to do with who is in charge of what is done in the treatment of those remains. We have the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that accepts that these descendants, these culturally affiliated groups, have a time-honored responsibility for stewardship of their ancestral remains, that the desecration of remains occurs if they are taken against the wishes and will of their descendants. And so that was certainly happening in New York. The African American community mobilized in so many ways, marches, hundreds of people at least in the streets, in prayer vigils, in the churches, in Gracie Mansion. Mayor Dinkins was there at the time on Capitol Hill. And we came in as a group of Howard University and researchers, archaeologists, historians, physical anthropologists, geneticists, and others, with our colleagues elsewhere in the country, to begin a process in which we sat down with the community and said, we went to the community first, right, as well as to the GSA. And we said, you know, we understand we should not work on these remains, that whatever, unless you approve it, that whatever is done with these remains should be approved by you. We had learned that from working with indigenous people and this was the 1980s that led up to the NAGPRA legislation. It was very hot in terms of, and I worked with the World Archaeological Congress, which had conversations with indigenous people around the world about the treatment of their remains and sacred objects. So we had learned that we needed to do archaeology differently. So the beginning of that was to concede that those remains, that sacred site does not belong to us, doesn't belong to archaeologists, didn't belong to the federal government. That's the most important, perhaps, step to take. That one is not in control. Right? Maybe this is the kind of humility Audrey Horning is talking about. But then we also realized that we had skills that would enable the telling of a history that had not been told about this property. You know, historians in 18th century New York, 19th century New York wrote about these people as property, what they were taxed for, how many there were, but very little about them as human beings. So we offered our services, essentially, to the community. And through a series of extensive forums downtown and in Harlem, exchanging written material, we developed a 160-some page research design based on that community's questions, primarily, that we had in our discussion of them, and some of our questions that they ultimately read and decided that they agreed to. So having done that, so we've now got two things. One is that because we because the community had control, and I'm understating all the ways in which they had control and how they achieved it. It was a very visible site at the time. Because they had control, we could proceed in an ethical manner, doing no harm, as if through informed consent. And they had control of any research. They had the no go. They could say, we're not going to let you do research at all, which is what they were inclined to do before we walked in. And use the usual practitioners, religious practitioners. This is what human beings do when they memorialize their dead. But they had a choice with us. And the kinds of research questions we pursued with also a budget of nearly $6 million in 1990s money, because it was important not just to my colleagues talking at professional meetings, but to the African-American community that had not been interested in its domestic archaeology. You know, there were tour trips going from DC or Chicago or New York to Egypt on a regular basis, but they were not interested in their domestic archaeology. And most of the domestic archaeology was pretty superficial. Now we had questions that were really better questions. And I'll just give one of, and from which we developed new methodology. So one is that might resonate. They asked, and they were the first to ask, what were the origins of these people buried in New York? What were the origins of African Americans? Their African origins, primarily. No geneticist had ever asked that question. And Alondra Nelson's book, The Social Life of DNA, will tell you the story of how our engagement with the public in New York ultimately led to all of these direct-to-consumer ancestry services, beginning with AfricanAncestry.com, and then others found out, oh, there's money in that. to 23andMe and others. I don't think they're at all as reliable as people believe they are. So I saw it begin. I know it's involved. But the interest is a reflection of where the question came from. And I just want to say, if I could say speak to one other thing, because I was thinking about, there's this question of control. I was listening to Dwayne Scheid and thinking of Samanisha Tillett's term civic estrangement. And she has, I think, aptly labeled the sentiments of many African Americans, if not most, who do not feel tied to national monuments or many of these historic sites that are interpreted not only by whites, but as a creation of a national identity that is really around whiteness, and often really very defensive of whiteness, of the virtue of whiteness, in ways that undermine the humanity of African Americans. I think of something like I could say Colonial Williamsburg, but there are many places like narratives like that where resistance is not shown. The resistance to slavery, that was everywhere, in every way. But when one begins to talk about in an interpretation, resistance to slavery, people ask, well, what were they resisting? Well, they were resisting the horror, the brutality of white people. And so their humanity, which rests within the notion of Blacks' humanity, rests in the fact that they were not cattle, they resisted, they wanted to be free, comes up against the notion of untainted white virtue, which is impossible. And so, I mean, this is one of the examples we found in our Remembering project when we talked to people around the state, African Americans, Euro Americans, that resistance is one of those things that's missing from the interpretation of history because because Black people are missing from the control of that interpretation. And so why do they not go to these sites? They find these sites they don't belong to them, and they're not for them. We often, I work with I'm on the Scholarly Advisory Committee of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I've worked with many museums, and often the museum visitor, the typical museum visitor we're to address is a white middle-class person. Well, the National Museum of African American History and Culture is flooded by Black people and everyone else. This is that the real hard story that also humanizes African Americans, humanizes the world. And it's a better story. So, and I can tell you that museum was guided by African American intellectuals and the public. And it is the most successful museum at the Smithsonian, although I recently heard that Air and Space is still the leading with visitors, but I suspect our museum might have surpassed them for a little while if they're back on top. The funding was so good that they had to separate themselves because the Smithsonian was basically sucking up the funding that was coming to the African American Museum. So they had to, create some separation, which is typical. They just matured in that setting. So there are many reasons why, many benefits of ethical engagement and without real power, and the last thing I'd say to this, without real power, what we get are various forms of superficial engagement. Since the African burial ground, civic engagement, often used at Park Service sites, is really more of a version of the old public archeology. No one's asking them for their research questions. In fact, they're being told the value of the archaeologist, who's usually a white person, the archaeologist's research questions. and if they're invited to work on the site that the archaeologist controls. What we need to do is turn that around so that we are working for that public specifically, in addition to all the others that are traditionally served by the Park Service.
Thank you. And I want to bring in Dr. Horning on this point of engagement, but more specifically, at her example of resistance at Slabtown, Uniontown. So Dr. Horning, can you share a little bit more about the history of Slabtown, as well as some of the examples that you have of where you've developed with the community inclusive practice, and share a little bit more about that process?
Sure. You know, when it comes to Slabtown, I think it's important to recognize that this community was created by African Americans who freed themselves by crossing Union lines in 1863. And then it was officially laid out. And it was a community, you know, where, you know, people were landowners, you know, and they held the land and they owned it. Yet the, you know, research done by Chandler Fitzsimons has demonstrated through, you know, once Colonial National Historical Park was established in the 1930s, that there was a consistent effort to try to basically divide the park from Slabtown and to slowly try to drain it away to the point where in the 1970s, of course, it did all become part of the battlefield. But in this story, which is obviously a traumatic story and one of displacement, which is not at all uncommon in the area between Park Service and various branches of military, many African-American communities, post-emancipation communities were displaced. I think it's really crucial to recognize that a community, and again, you know, these are some of the insights coming as well from Chandler's work, you know, the community is more than just the location and the buildings. And so I think it's very important that when we talk about the Slabtown, Uniontown community, that we recognize that that community still exists, even if it's been uprooted from the place, you know, where it first came together. And that, I think, needs to be a big part of the conversation. I think here I'm echoing both Dr. Blakey and Dr. Jones and Dr. Scheid is, you know, that's a recent displacement in the 1970s. And so it's, you know, there's lasting trauma from the Jamestown story, absolutely. But it's separated in terms of its visceral nature. And that's not the case with Slabtown. And so I think, you know, there, in terms of drawing from other practice of my own, I think about working in Northern Ireland, you know, where the histories that we engage with, you know, are of very recent violence and trauma. And so most of the work has to be oriented towards recognizing and reducing harm, you know, and not hurting people by going to a site and talking about its history and saying how we want to share it and how we want the wider world to know about it, you know, when those are very personal histories as well. And I think one of the ways to move in the right direction is to do exactly as Dr. Jones said, which is to be very upfront in acknowledging the culpability of the structures and of the Park Service itself, as was in harming people, you know. And so, you know, one of the things that's been so good in the last few years, working together with my colleagues here in the Park Service at Colonial National Historical Park, is the willingness to do that, to, as the previous superintendent said in a conversation with me, to provoke and make the visitors leave Jamestown disturbed. And of course, you know, we've already talked about what most of those visitors look like, and middle-class white folks don't want to go to a site and be made upset, but that's part of the process. That's part of whatever kind of healing might emerge. Those sites, of course, also have to be open to everybody. And, you know, there's a difference between telling the stories of violence and trauma to perhaps wake up many visitors, but that's not the only story that needs to be told at these sites. And that's where the persistence of the Slabtown community, all of the episodes of resistance at a place like Jamestown, including, you know, some quite, you know, violent resistance in the 19th century on Jamestown Island by enslaved people, those stories need to be addressed as well. So hopefully that has, in a roundabout way, addressed your question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Horning. And for our audience members, please feel free to share your questions in the chat box. While I'm waiting on those, I want to ask another question to follow up with Dr. Jones on a point here. More about some of the theoretical and methodological aspects of your work. Could you share out some of the emerging trends? So Dr. Horning and Dr. Blakey have talked about what they've been able to establish and shared authority with the community. But are there other emerging trends that are happening in the field right now in pushing the bounds on how you really do deep community engagement and empower the community to be a part of this process?
Sure. And so I'll maybe start with the the well project, the East Marshall Street well project. I would say that, again, building on the model, of the African burial ground in which there's an ethical clientage, in which Dr. Blakey was saying, we more or less work for the community. I think we see with this project, you have a more kind of defined, a smaller defined collection of individuals who were the victims of these, past misdeeds, right? Just we're thinking the number we have now is about 53. We'll actually be doing genetic research to kind of match individuals to reconstruct discrete individuals. So we'll have a better accounting of that number, hopefully within a year's time or so. But the theoretical innovation, I think, of this project, and again, this comes out of the work of the planning committee that was working on this prior to kind of my involvement. I came and attended the community conversations, and because I was a longtime resident of Richmond, people felt comfortable enough with kind of me coming on as a Descendant community member. But that Descendant community group, you'll recall, I mentioned, was named the Family Representative Council. And so that Family Representative Council, that term itself indicates a relationship. It suggests a social ancestry, a surrogate family in the absence of any lineal descents, at least for now, that we know of for now. Genetic research will also look into possible connections with living individuals, which opens up a whole other host of questions that we'll need to engage with. But lacking those relationships, those known relationships now, they developed this Descendant community group in the form of family members. Right? We were meant to be a symbolic or surrogate family members who, as any other family would speak for their dead, speak for their ancestors. And so again, Dr. Blakey can speak to the actual thought process behind this. He was on that planning committee that actually formulated, this aspect of the plan, of the process. But that in itself, I think, represents a kind of an evolution of some of the ways that we will probably need to think about this, particularly for African Americans, for whom, from site to site, from state to state, we'll have to, kind of construct these groups where we don't necessarily have bodies, elected or symbolic bodies to speak for the dead. And we'll be creating these groups. This I see as a very important innovation and kind of building on the broader model, right, of ethical clientage. At Jamestown, I think one of the things that we have not yet fully addressed yet, but that is certainly on our radars, our collective radar, is the need to engage with multiple Descendant communities. It's come up several times. Community members themselves have noted this. We, of course, are very aware that these are multiple historical narratives coming from multiple communities who had all been a part of this story of the kind of early colonial history in this part of the nation. And so hearing those voices in concert, I think, is very important, that we don't reproduce some of the issues and limitations that we're now trying to work ourselves out of, but that we do so in a way that's very thoughtful and is most constructive for these communities, who are themselves, of course, as we all know, very very diverse. And so having all these voices together and figuring out, what that process might look like, I think is something that certainly poses a great challenge to us. But I think that will be a major contribution as we go down that road, both theoretically and methodologically.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And we just got a question in the chat box. And I want to turn this conversation either to Dr. Horning or Dr. Blakey on this one about community empowerment. So someone asked, how much have youth and children been involved in these engagements, since they will ultimately be carrying forth the activities and imperatives of the work that's being done now? So youth and children engagement, just going to open it up to the panel to speak to that question.
I'll just jump in with one quick observation on that, and this is drawing from experience in Northern Ireland. I mean, obviously, yes, it's a good thing to involve all generations, and especially youth. But that's something we hear a lot in Northern Ireland of people of my generation and older, and in some ways, it's a way of devolving responsibility. So I think that with engagement, it has to be with everybody. There's, to go back to Dr. Blakey's comments about public engagement, public archaeology models, the standard one is to bring school children onto a site and let them work for a while. Well, I just don't know how much that changes the world. It's a nice thing to do. It's important. It's part of the work. But I think that, the really challenging conversations have to involve everybody.
I should say that children are mostly indirectly involved in a place like New York or James Madison's Montpelier, and by which I mean these are mostly adults, or all adults, and mostly older adults, who are defending cemeteries. And we're really talking about two related issues here. One is cemeteries, and the other is the interpretation of the past, of memory. They are quite related for our species, but they are also distinct in some ways that we might take a look at. And so it tends to be older people who are very concerned about the dignity of cemeteries. But they are also, as in New York, the ones who said, we want the story told for our grandchildren. That was their motivation. And in that indirect way, children were always involved. We had in New York an Office of Public Education and Interpretation, so that we're folks who went out as public educators to schools in New York and had lots of opportunities for education and even the arts in what was then a center at Six World Trade, an office at Six World Trade Center, which collapsed on us in 9/11. But we've always, in the projects we do, we always reach out for the young. Now there is at the African Burial Ground National Monument, it's now a U.S. National Monument, thus it's in the hands of the Park Service. There's also a visitor center that's very, very actively attended by school children in the New York area and elsewhere. So I think, the leadership on this has been very adult. I'd like to see more younger people, more young adults involved, and at Montpelier, we've seen some of that. But in fact, it tends towards older people.
Yeah. Here's another question from the chat box, and it's related to Dr. Horning's point about white folks not wanting to go to a site that makes them uncomfortable. So the question is, and this is again to our panel, how does one go about changing that, making people comfortable with being uncomfortable? What recommendations are there? Do you have for changing how people think about these things that may make them a bit hesitant to want to visit, or a site that doesn't tell the shining example of whiteness? So what are some recommendations there?
I'd like to say two things about that.
Sure.
So when we developed the rubric at Montpelier, the National Trust rubric, at one point there was a discussion of the idea that the interpretations that involve descendant community and so forth needed to be agreeable to everyone. And some of us said, oh, that's exactly how nothing changes. That is exactly how nothing changes. And so we did not include that language. And I think it implies clearly that everybody doesn't have to come to everything. And as the world is changing, the markets are changing in the South, and you may well be aware that the South is moving away from hoop skirts towards civil rights museums. The world is changing. And then the last example I want to give of this is from I was at the donors opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. You know, you go down on the elevator to the first level, and it's all about the slave trade of mainly the 17th and 18th century. It's ugly and complex and interesting for me. And we're there, many of these were people who donated something. Large crowd of people there for the first time enjoying that exhibition. And we could hear a white woman sort of stomping through the space, saying loud as though we needed to hear, "When will this ever end?" Someone trailing behind her, I imagined that it was a somewhat embarrassed husband. She doesn't have to be there. Should we deny ourselves a powerful truth because of some few individuals? There's a lot of discussion in Virginia education as well, as on some interpretive sites, about how a few critical individuals have shut down a whole conversation, an honest conversation about African-American life and Euro-American life in America, in American history. So no, everybody doesn't have to come to everything.
Yeah, Dr. Horning, Dr. Jones, excuse me, care to comment?
Yeah, I think I'll just make one fairly short observation, is that, you know, we have an obligation to the evidence. We have an ethical obligation to the people in the past. You know, we elect ourselves the ones who will tell their stories. And if we choose to tell only the palatable bits for a certain, segment of the population, then we're being dishonest and unethical to those folks. So yeah, people will be uncomfortable. But when people are confronted with things they didn't know about, they react differently. So some people will walk away and they'll totally reject it, like the example we just heard, although we don't know, maybe she went home and rethought. Sometimes it takes a while before people come to terms, because they have, basically they're confronted with something new and different and maybe frightening, destabilizing to who they think they are. But then they have to accommodate that evidence and that information one way or another. And that is, that's how things change.
Yeah, I can only piggyback, on that to say that, I think it's common, it's easy to say that, we need to move people out of their comfort zones. We used to say with the Race Project is that we need people to develop new comfort zones, right? Is that, and so the question becomes, how do you do that? And with the understanding that not everyone will go on that journey with you. Not everyone will undergo that process, and that's fine. That can't be an excuse not to do the work. But to the broader question, for those who can be reached and those who will be reached, I think we have to be very clear that what we're after is cultural change, right? This is very fundamental, change. I think in terms of, as Dr. King, who kind of talked about the difference between desegregation and true integration, right? He said, we've only begun to scratch the surface on this thing, and we can see how easily some of these policies have reversed with the resegregation of schools and the hypersegregation of living spaces and things. And I think, if we're looking, and and I was recently rereading some of the a piece by one of our giants, who we lost, of course, Dr. Mullings, Leith Mullings. She referenced the work of Amilcar Cabral, and he talked about, culture as the flower of history. And I think, the work that we're doing really creates new pasts. I was just grading a student's paper and she said, we can't change the past. And it kind of hit me. It's easy to say that, but we in fact are changing the past. We may not be changing past behaviors. We can't change past actions, but this is new history for some, for most of us, for many of us. The research aspect, the discovery aspect of this produces new histories. We saw that with the African Burial Ground Project. We're still in the process learning new histories for these people. And so to the extent that we can actually change the past and change history, so to speak, metaphorically, that's what's required, I think, absolutely required for the cultural change to kind of follow Cabral's thinking, right? And so I think, yes, not everyone will do this. As Dr. Horning said, we don't know what became of that woman after her visit to the museum, but for those who can and who will go on the journey, I really don't see an alternative, to doing this work. As Dr. Blakey said, things are changing. And they won't go back. They can't go back to what they've been. So
you remind me. Oh,
go ahead, Dr.
Just to say, I feel compelled to say, as a person of a certain age and political tendency, that Amilcar Cabral was a revolutionary leader in Guinea, and there's a saying that we all used to love of Cabral, which was, he would say, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories."
Yes. I heard that first from you, Dr. Blakey.
It did. An admonition to everyone, and to his own, right? Tell no lies, claim no easy victories.
Yes. Please read The Weapon of Theory. Read his piece. Very appropriate.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to bring in Dr. Scheid here. As America's storyteller, the National Park Service is also grappling with some of these things. What have you seen in the field, and how is the Park Service, National Park Service, approaching telling some uncomfortable truths? For some, let me just not say it's uncomfortable for everyone.
Right.
Some uncomfortable truths for people.
Yeah, I mean, if I could go back just for 1 second to the other, I think that, like was said by everyone, not everybody's going to change, but I think that by putting out these stories, it does provide people with information and education about some of the about things in the past. I grew up in Midwestern Illinois, in the south part of Illinois, in an all-white community, and so I had no interactions with people of color until I went in the military. And that's a problem. And my family, we didn't travel to national parks. We didn't travel anywhere. Really, we went to visit with my grandparents. But once I got out in the world and saw and learned so much more about what's out there, and learned about, this African-American past, and, it's an opportunity for people to expand and grow. Right. And so it might be uncomfortable to talk about some of these things, as it should be. And at the same time, I think that we need to provide those opportunities for people to have those interactions so that they can see something different and can experience something different that maybe alters their lives and maybe changes where they want to be. And so I think for the Park Service, for us, it's definitely a challenge to tell those stories, and one of the things I'll say, at Colonial, we're a Revolutionary War, at Yorktown, we're a Revolutionary War park. In the past, we haven't communicated about Slabtown very often, or about the enslaved, the life of the enslaved in the Yorktown village or in the Revolutionary War. And I think that a lot of our visitors, like that we're a Revolutionary War park, and they like seeing cannons, and they like seeing the earthworks. And so I think that we need to do more. Obviously, we need to do more work to share the story of the living people, rather than, the Washingtons and Lafayettes and Rochambeaus, right? We need to talk about the enslaved life in Yorktown, and talk about what it was like, when bombs were coming in, and interpreting it from the enslaved perspective. Like, what was that like when, you're being bombed because you're behind lines, so you're being bombed by Americans, or, the colonists at that point, and so we need to tell more of those stories. I think that there are other park sites throughout Virginia and throughout the Park Service in our region, especially, that are telling a lot of stories and that have expanded those stories. And I know, that I think that there is a recognition that we need to change the stories that we're telling and to share those untold stories. I would say it's a work in progress for many parks, and yeah, I mean, and so, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it and try to figure it out and do that work that needs to be done. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Scheid. I'd like to bring in Dr. Horning. She has to sign off in a bit, but wanted to get some of your final thoughts on this, Dr. Horning. So please take the floor.
Thank you. And my apologies to everyone. I have to teach a class in a few minutes' time. Just thinking about the role of the National Park Service, there's tremendous opportunities there. The sites and the histories throughout the country. I've spent time, criticizing the past, and what the Park Service has done in the formation of many parks was based on, displacement and inequality. But that becomes the powerful story to share. I think what we're all grappling with, and maybe the conversation will turn to this after I unfortunately have to leave, is how to do that in a way that does give the power to the descendant communities who need to be, leading conversation about what, how those stories are told and in what way. So that's, I think, our overall challenge. And if we can get it right with these projects, then that will be, a model hopefully for other national park locations, because they are an amazing resource for the whole country and for everybody in the country. And that's that inclusivity side of the piece also comes with relinquishing the, I suppose, institutional power. So again, my apologies for having to leave. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thanks to everybody who's come along, and I'm sure you'll move things much further along after I leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Horning. So Dr. Horning raises a great point about engaging descendant communities and really creating a process around it. I want to go to one of the good question in our chat about thinking broadly about what types of tools do you think are needed to institutionalize this need for the type of work in our country? So kind of going beyond very thoughtful and intentional professionals like Dr. Horning and Blakey and Jones and Dr. Scheid and others. How can the country institutionalize some of this work in engagement and discovery and collaborative decision making?
I can just say, I think, the Park Service has had some initiatives in the past to try to expand on who gets hired and adding diversity in hiring and in those processes, and making the Park Service a place that people of color want to work. And so there have been initiatives around that. I think that we need to expand that. Like, people, when they come to visit the site, people of color need to see other people of color doing work in resource stewardship and science, doing work in interpretation, doing work in maintenance, doing work in admin, doing work in law enforcement, doing that, doing those roles. They need to see people who look like them doing the work. And there was a study that came out, I think last year or the year before, that basically said, even though there's, this initiative for expanding the diversity of our employees, like, we're just not there. We're not meeting that goal. And I think we need to figure out some way that we can meet that goal and increase the diversity of our staff. And I think that'll help bring in those diverse ideas and, the experience of the African American community to just be like, hey, no, we do need to talk about these things here. And so I think that that needs to expand.
Thank you, Dr. Scheid. I also like to bring in someone who invited us to do this panel. She is the Bureau Chief Anthropologist, Jennifer Talkin Spalding. So Jennifer, if you'd like to unmute your mic to share out a little bit about what the Park Service is doing in this space, and thank you for your question there. We are all ears.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for, this is a really engaging panel. So thank you for being with us today. And I appreciate both the people that are here listening to the panel right now and all of the people who will listen to it afterwards because we know we're recording today. So I think, my question was also directed not only just to kind of what Park Service is doing, but broadly. Because one of the things that I work with in our office is the agency's implementation of NAGPRA responsibilities across the agency. And I know that there has been some discussion before about African-American burial sites and how to elevate and have a conversation on a national level about unknown burial sites and what to do, And it happens not only in, as you have all said, in cities, in states, and in federal lands, but certainly in private lands too. And so maybe it's an unfair or a tossing out this question in a very broad way, but I really kind of wanted to say, are there other things out there that are needed to elevate this conversation and the understanding of it, even beyond kind of the groups that we've been talking about?
Sure. So did you want to take that? Want to start with that, Dr. Blakey? Oh. I was just going to say, well, I'm sure we're probably all somewhat familiar with the recent legislation. I know that our senator here, Donald McKeechin, was one of the prime movers behind the recent bill looking to provide some protections for example, for African-American cemeteries. I do think the type of change that we've, for the most part, been discussing, these kind of deep, ideological and cultural issues takes time, right? We've talked about changing in the past and the intergenerational reach, hopefully, of the type of work that we're doing now. However, in the interim, there are policy things that can be done. There are legislative things that can and should be done to offer these protections. Also, for example, with the Well Project, we are now, there's every expectation that additional remains might be found as they're constantly doing construction work here. So we're looking to establish a policy that might become a model for other state institutions should they come across these remains. All right, so there's so at various levels, I think these kind of institutional and policy changes can be made. It is tricky, as we said. There is no kind of singular or even a small number of voices the way that some communities have. For example, with Native Americans, there is no AACPRA, perhaps it might be called, that would be a corollary to the NAGPRA legislation. And the voices, as I mentioned earlier, would have to be constructed. These groups would have to be constructed from place to place, but there are principles that can be established. And so the principle, a chief one of which being the ethical clientage idea. And then also, and Dr. Blakey certainly can speak to this from his work at Montpelier, the idea of the, I believe the phrase, Dr. Blakey, structural parity, all right? Getting people at the table, in addition to perhaps piggyback on what you were saying there, Dwayne, that it's important that people see people of color doing this work, but it's also important that people, are the people who we don't see, those board members and so forth who we don't know, right? That we have voices at those tables as well with real decision-making power. I think that's what's going to drive it. But there are some actions that are being taken, at the kind of legislative and kind of and policy levels.
Yeah, I like. I agree with that sort of still fragile status in which law is being drafted. Folks have been talking about a NAGPRA-like law for unmarked African American graves, certainly for a long time. But there's ethics. And as you say, the application of the clientage model, or one in which a descendant community has the right to determine the disposition of its dead, which is what NAGPRA allows, is it something that might be understood generally as ethical. And that, I remember in the 1980s, when the museum and anthropological community were trying to restrict Native American access to their collections as much as possible. The Museums Association had a rule first that was, well, if you could identify the individual by name, and only if you could identify the individual by name could you repatriate or rebury that individual, which of course, in the halls of the Smithsonian, it was rarely the case, but where it was the case, I helped the Native American Rights Fund return its individuals. But that's about obstruction. There are, many ways, as we showed in New York and in many other places with working with descendant communities, as in Richmond, the case of the East Marshall Street well, where you just assemble or allow to make an opportunity for that community to assemble itself, and then give it what support you can. What that requires is the will. In New York, the GSA got the will when things started to fall apart. And even the legend of, I know it circulates in government trainings these days about what not to do, includes the African burial ground. Well, people know that it's wrong. But here's the other thing. On the other side, what I see happening more often is that the developers are sometimes in bed with the municipalities. I think that's going on at Montgomery County around the Moses Cemetery right now, where the county Parks and Planning did not have basic respect for that community to do the necessary archaeology, even to assure them where the remains were and were not. That casual racist disregard, and of course, is something that is pervasive. And of course, there is this, the values that would have one see their opportunity attached to developers at the expense of basic human rights, goes beyond racism, but these are not mutually exclusive. So yes, law and policy need to be developed. But right now, the question is, what will you do?
Well said. Dr. Blakey, I want to stay with you for a moment and wanted to get your comment on the importance of descendant efforts from a regional or state perspective across sites like Monticello, Montpelier, Arlington House, and Fort Monroe, and so many others.
Oh, I didn't understand what
the importance of descendant efforts. So, yep, just what's being done on the sites and the importance of that work that's happening in those areas.
Well, they're very diverse. Everybody's at sort of a different stage. One could think of it as stages of the implementation of the National Trust rubric, which nonetheless comes after some of these developments. The rubric helps understand that true community empowerment is the measure of exemplary engagement, and various forms of disempowerment. Sometimes it's just having so many stakeholders that the descendant community loses its voice, and the stakeholders include archaeologists and municipalities, and it's a farce, and they'll call it civic engagement. So there are all kinds of ways in which the voice, by virtue of their empowerment, may be undermined. And it's all very, very much like, the sort of contemporary US sort of play on anti-racism, where you have these diversity regimes that talk a lot about diversity, but actually, I think it was Ta-Nehisi Coates who said, what does that have to do with reparations? This is not what we are talking about. Diversity is a good thing, but that's a different thing than social justice to people who have been and are being abused by white privilege. So there are these little organizations are part of America. They're engaging with these sites of memory at different points and with different abilities and in different ways. So I think really the one that I'm paying closest attention to is James Madison's Montpelier. It's where the rubric began, but where they are as a descendant community, organized, well organized, elected, democratically elected by virtue of the staff of Montpelier's 20 years of work and embrace of that community. I mean, I don't act there as a descendant. I don't avoid conflict of interest, but my family is descended from there. Some of them, my family's home place and cemetery is just down the road from Montpelier. So I've been a part of this 20 years. And we have not only have the descendants been building family through our discussions there, but with the staff building community. It is a really, I'm a bit of a skeptic. This is more than I imagined 20 years ago would occur. And then they brought the rubric-based structural parity idea, or asserted it, with the old board of directors, who immediately went into classic D'Angelo white fragility, and just could not see how they could share power with these people. But with the help of, the National Trust was not, I don't think was enthusiastic about getting in the fray, they could not deny that they had to take a position on their own rubric. And so now together, the Montpelier Descendants community and the National Trust are working, negotiating effectively with the board, and they will have 50% membership on that board, I believe, the descendant community. And then you have the opportunity, and they've also received with the descendant community, each of them in the memorandum of agreement, both the board and the descendant community and one other entity, have equal responsibility for $1 million that Governor Northam has ushered in from the state of Virginia for their memorialization. And these people, let me say this, and this is something I can say for all kinds of descendant community groups that we're working with, from Colonial Williamsburg to the folks at Jamestown and Slabtown, who actually the IHB has worked with for many years, to Africatown, to Bethesda. These are extraordinarily well-equipped human beings. These descendants range greatly, but I wouldn't be surprised if their average education was higher than the boards, who have been sitting there forever. They are not to be played with. They know how to raise money and that kind of thing. And so I am watching this happen with great interest. And Montpelier is organizing, the UVA, sorry, not UVA, but is the Monticello has a rising organization. So I am interested in seeing how these organizations, as they, so there's one in River Road Museum in Louisiana. There are many efforts. So they're growing, and I'm very interested in seeing what will happen when they begin to talk with one another.
Thank you, Dr. Blakey. So I want to stay with you, but this is the last round robin before we end the session. But Dr. Blakey, you mentioned 20 years, and 20 years flies by very quickly. What would you like to see happen in the field? What are you expecting? And this is, again, a question for the panelists, but I want to start with Dr. Blakey about what does 20 years from now look like for the field of archaeology, anthropology.
I can't say I've actually thought about that, but it may be obvious that I hope that public engagement will be commonplace, and that we will recognize that we don't own the past, and that we have services to offer to communities of people with various stakes in the past, some more stake than others. It's a plural democracy. This is I'm working towards, I can say that, the plural democratization of science. So that what I guess I have thought about is that ultimately I would like to see science become more responsive and interwoven in the interest of everyday people who are concerned about, in our historical research, concerned about their history in the way that science serves other interests that people have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones.
So I'd have to confess to not giving much thought, perhaps surprisingly, to that question either. But I would say that we've seen what happens when the national parks and other powerful institutions throw their weight behind the status quo. And so I hope that we'll see. My hope is that we'll see what happens when, through descendant community engagement and perhaps other forces, what happens when they throw that same weight behind social justice and restorative justice for members within the discipline. I think we're going to have to grapple seriously with whiteness, as Dr. Blakey has said numerous times today. I think whiteness as an ecological threat, as something that is really foundational, to us. If we're on the Titanic and our focus is on these outward expressions of white supremacy and so forth, that's only the iceberg, which is of course an imminent threat, but it's not the ocean of whiteness that's surrounding us, in which many people are drowning in daily. And so I think that is going to be taken seriously, the same way that when we look at other forms of inequality, we kind of we name and look at the specific power disparities that are there. I think we'll have to look at whiteness in the same way, and I think that will bear out within the discipline as new voices emerge, and as young, ideally and hopefully as young white scholars also wrestle seriously with what it means to be a white American, not in any essentialist way, but in a way that reflects the historical path that we've taken, and it's led us to this point where when we talk about racism, we are by and large talking about, at least in the structural sense, about white privilege and supremacy. And so I think those, if we can marry those factors, I think we will see a productive change over the next several decades.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Dr. Scheid?
Yes, I mean, I would say, like, what I would like to happen is for this work to happen, 2 years ago, so that when we're thinking about projects that are coming up like this, that the group would already be formed and already be there. And so, I mean, I would like, I'd like to be sharing power now. I mean, and knowing that it's the decisions that are made about cultural resources at a park are more than one person should be doing, right? It's more than me, it's more than I should be doing. It should be informed by and in partnership with the African American community and the Native American community. And so my hope is that within 2 years, we're at a place where we have a group that's formed up and running and has full, that parity that Dr. Blakey talked about, and is able to, work on things and to say, we don't care about those sites washing away or eroding, or yes, we want to know what's there. And, I mean, the sooner it could happen, the better it would be for all of us, I think, and I know that, and I imagine that, for Dr. Blakey, it's hard to see that because he's had 30 years of the government sort of being like, we'll do what we want. And, and that's not where I think that the people at Colonial want to be right now. We want to be looking for a way forward and moving that way rapidly. So.
Thank you very much. So
I've got to go teach. I'm sorry. On that optimistic note, fortunately. All right. Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Blakey. In closing, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for joining the conversation today. One through line in this conversation has been institutional humility, and institutions are made up of people, and the panelists represent some powerful organizations. So thank you all. I'm very humbled. I know you all will also humble these institutions to move towards shared authority as we look to the next 20 years of the field. So with that, I'd like to turn the conversation back to Superintendent Dance to close us out.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to you, Monica, for guiding us through this conversation so wonderfully. It felt effortless for something that is so important and impactful. I think about the next 20 years often in the working groups I'm working with. And we've been talking about all of these themes, acknowledging the harm and empowering people to tell their own stories. And so that's the work that's ahead of us. And so I thank all of our attendees for your time. And with that, I turn things over to Quinn.
All right, thank you, everybody. This concludes the meeting. At this time, you can join Dr. Scheid and Dr. Jones over on the Hoover Meetup Channel 1 for further discussion. For security reasons, this live discussion room is first come, first serve, up to 30 participants. Very importantly, upon entry, you may be asked to download a Chrome browser extension. Please disregard this message. You will be able to access the channel meetup by simply clicking out of the extension notice, typing your name, and selecting Join Meeting. Thank you all for attending. We hope you enjoyed the session.